Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. For those in-house, please check cell phones one last time as a courtesy to see that they're off as we prepare to begin. And, of course, we will post the program on the Heritage homepage following today's presentations for everyone's future reference. And we remind our Internet viewers that questions or comments can be sent to us, or even in this case, Discovery Institute, at any time, simply emailing us here at Heritage at speaker@heritage.org. Our program today is co-hosted with the Discovery Institute. The Discovery Institute was founded in 1991 by Bruce Chapman and George Gilder. It is headquartered in Seattle, Washington, and promotes thoughtful analysis and effective action on local, regional, national, as well as international issues. Its mission is to advance a culture of purpose, creativity, and innovation. Discovery has a special concern for the role that science and technology play in our culture and how they can advance free markets, illuminate public policy, and support the theistic foundations of the West. Representing the Institute today is Stephen Burry, who is their president. He has been president since December 2011 and associated with the Institute for 15 years. He served in various capacities in the local, state, and federal government levels. He founded or co-founded Stewardship Partners in 1998, which takes a free market approach to environmental challenges. He is also the founder of the Roanoke Conference, a statewide political conference designed to connect activists and elected officials with students and young professionals. He is an active member of the business community in Seattle, as well as his hometown of Newcastle, Washington. We're pleased to welcome Steve and our friends from Discovery here today, and he will introduce our special guest. Steve, welcome.
Thank you so much, John. It's a great day to be at the Heritage Foundation. Heritage, for more than 40 years has been a leader in the conservative movement. And I think that in and of itself is a great legacy. But frankly, more important than that is the partnerships and friendships that they've developed with like-minded organizations around the country and the help that they have provided over the years. So I'm very grateful to John Hilbolt, to Becky Norton Dunlop, and others, the staff here at Heritage, for welcoming us here today. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today. I know you're going to enjoy his talk, which you'll find thought-provoking as well. Don Nielsen attended the University of Washington, received a bachelor's degree in business there, got an MBA later at Harvard University. Don't hold that against him. But then subsequently went into business as an entrepreneur. In the 80s, he took a company called Hazelton Corporation public, a very successful entrepreneur, but after his life in business in 1992, decided to retire. But he didn't really retire. He dedicated his energy to public education and to being involved in the system and figuring out how to bring about reforms, and that's the topic of his lecture today. His book is Every School. The website is www.everyschoolthebook.com. I'd encourage you to take a look at that website if you're interested in purchasing the book or learning more about Don. Don is a senior fellow of Discovery Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome him to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, very much, and thank you, John, for allowing us to be here today. It's a joy to be at the Heritage Foundation. I've been a fan of your organization for many years, and I have watched and enjoyed seeing the efforts that you've put forth on social and economic issues over the years, not the least of which is education. And today I want to talk to you about education. Before I get into that particular subject, though, I want to let everybody know that the proceeds of this book will go only to the Discovery Institute, and the purpose of the proceeds will be to create an education center inside the Discovery Institute for the purpose of implementing and helping states implement the ideas that are in the book and the ideas that I'm going to talk to you about today. So we'll get on with our little conversation about education. As Steve said to you, I'm an entrepreneur. In fact, I'm probably as close to the American dream as you're likely to see today, certainly. My parents were immigrants from Denmark, And I was able to get a wonderful education, start a business in the basement of an A&P store, take it to the New York Stock Exchange, and then sell it to a Fortune 500. Now, that's about as good a dream as you can get. And I know I've been a very lucky guy. But in doing that, I was able to sell the company in 1987, and the people who bought it, which was Corning, they asked me to stay on for 5 additional years, and I said I would, and I did. But I knew then, 5 years in advance, the very day I was going to retire. So I had 5 years to figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And I picked public education. And there were several routes to that decision. My company's headquarters were right here in Vienna, Virginia. My wife and I spent 23 years right in this region. And when I was a CEO of the company, I was engaged in junior achievement. And I was on the board of junior achievement for about 12 years, chairman for 3 years here in the Washington metropolitan area. I was also on the board of the Fairfax County Public Schools Industry Advisory Board, and we were able to build and develop the Thomas Jefferson School for Science and Technology, which occurred while I was on that board. A wonderful school, as you may well know. I was also an observant of the education that my own children received. My eldest daughter went all the way through K-12 public education and received a wonderful education. My son did not. And my youngest daughter kind of had a partly public, partly private education system. But I picked education as to where I was going to spend my time. And so I didn't know what I would do in education. And so I decided, not being too shy, to make a phone call. And the phone call I made was to Lamar Alexander. At the time, Lamar Alexander was the Secretary of Education for the Department of Education here in Washington, D.C. So I dialed the phone, and I got on the phone, and of course his assistant answered, and I said, "This is Don Nielsen. I'm a retired executive of a New York Stock Exchange company, and I've decided to spend the balance of my working life in public education, and I'd love to talk to the secretary." Well, they apparently hadn't received too many of those kind of phone calls before, because I got right through. And Lamar, we arranged for an appointment. I went down to see Lamar, but it was a very short meeting, and Lamar immediately introduced me to a gentleman named David Kearns. And David Kearns was then the Deputy Secretary of Education, and he had formerly been the CEO of Xerox. Wonderful gentleman. And he and I had 3 subsequent lunches over the next 18 months. But David and I had a very good conversation to begin with, and then he also suggested to me that I talk to several other people, most of whom at that time were in the department. And so, of course, I did that. And then everybody I talked to suggested, well, you really ought to talk to so-and-so. And initially, so-and-so was in the greater Washington, D.C. area. For the first 6 months of my little sojourn into education, I was talking to people right here locally. I talked to the heads of the national unions, the 2 presidents of the AFT and the NEA. I talked to the chairman of the House and Senate education committees. I talked to all the think tank leaders that were involved in public education. I met with the president of the Catholic Schools Association. And I read every book and periodical that people told me I should read. And so I tried to do my homework. But pretty soon, so-and-so was not in Washington, D.C. And so I went to Louisville, Kentucky, and to Houston, Texas, and Sacramento, California, and down in Florida, and up into Maine. In all, I went to 19 different states. I visited over 100 schools. I talked to over 24 deans of education schools. And I met with 5 governors. So I did my homework. And I came home one night to my wife and I said, I'm getting smart enough to be dangerous. Because I'd really learned a lot about our public school system. And I decided, as a result of those interviews and that travel, that I needed to get inside the system to make a difference. Because what I witnessed around the country were thousands, if not tens of thousands, of people doing their level best to improve their schools, and quite frankly, to no avail. And so I decided the answer was to get inside the system. And the second opinion I had, or decision I made, was that the urban district was the entity of choice, or entity of change. And the reason for that is that of the 50 million children in our public school system, over half are in urban systems. And 90% of our minorities are in urban systems. And it's the minorities, by and large, that are not receiving the kind of education we need to have them receive. So the 2 decisions were, get inside the system, and the urban district's the entity of change. Now, my wife and I wanted to return back to Seattle, which was our home and where our family still resided. And so by definition then, it was going to be the Seattle Public Schools. So then the question is, how are you going to get inside the system? Well, as you find out, someone like me is not qualified to be a teacher. I'm not qualified to be a principal. No one's going to hire me as a superintendent. So the only entry point was the school board. So one night I came home and told my wife, when we go to Seattle, I'm going to run for the school board. She absolutely thought I'd lost it, you know, but that's what I did. And in November of 1993, I ran for the Seattle School Board and was elected. And as it turned out, I was the only new member of the board in that election. So there were 6 other incumbents and me. Now, of course, I had already established an agenda. I knew what I wanted to do if I got elected. And so I had this agenda, and I wrote it out, and I gave it to my colleagues at our first meeting. And I said, this is what I'd like to try to do while I'm on this board. Take a look at it. If you like it, let's work together to make it happen. If you don't like it, let's discuss it. Maybe I'll like your idea better than mine. But the agenda was set, and they pretty much bought into most of it. And the very first item on the agenda was to get rid of the existing superintendent. Now, the existing superintendent was a wonderful man, but he'd been there 12 years, and he had not changed the school system. And I felt we needed a change agent because my agenda was about change. And so I could also tell my colleagues that the person we're looking for is not in public education. And the reason I could say that unequivocally is because I had traveled all over the country. And for the last year of my sojourn, I was looking for a district that had carried quality schools to scale. Was there a district out there that had multiple high-quality performing schools? And the answer was no. You could find all kinds of wonderful schools in our public school systems. And incidentally, I'm going to be pretty critical about our public education system as this talk goes on. But I want you all to know that we are blessed to have some wonderful educators out there. There's some tremendous teachers and principals all over the country doing their level best to educate our children. And in some cases, they're taking children from the most destitute neighborhoods and home environments and doing miracles with them. And so we need to celebrate those teachers, but we simply don't have enough of them. But at any rate, first order of business was to get rid of the superintendent. So we agreed not to renew his contract. And I could say unequivocally, the person we're looking for is not in public education, because had they been there, I'd have found them. I know I would have found them. And so we hired a business search firm, not an education search firm. And this business search firm, which happened to be Heidrick & Struggles, they found a guy named John Stanford. John Stanford was at the time the county executive for Fulton County, Georgia. But John Stanford was a retired Army Major General. And he spent 30 years in the United States Army. And when he retired from the Army, he became the county executive for Fulton County. And in his 4 years at Fulton County, he had taken the county from the lower third of all counties in financial ratings to the upper tier, and he had put in $1 billion of infrastructure into the county roads and bridges, and he had done all of that without raising taxes. So here was a guy who was by definition a leader who had transformed a public institution. My kind of guy. So we offered him a job. Now, a sidebar. He said to me one time, he went home and told his wife, Pat, you won't believe the phone call I got today. And she said, what was that? He said, a headhunter called me and wanted to find out if I'd be willing to be superintendent of schools in Seattle, Washington. And they both started laughing because it was a preposterous idea. But we convinced him to do it. And he came to Seattle, started in September 1995. John was an absolute miracle worker. Most charismatic leader I've ever met before or since. John transformed our city's attitude toward its schools. The very first thing we did, as the very first vote, was to eliminate mandatory busing in the city of Seattle. Now, turned out John Stanford was African American, and that allowed us to do it literally without any complaints. It was the very first vote, and it happened almost without a murmur. But it had been in place for over 20 years, and it had literally taken our school system down. And I don't mean that because of race. I mean that because busing systematically took parents out of the equation of the decision as to where their children go to school. That's the problem with busing. But anyhow, we eliminated busing. So then the other thing we found out, and I knew this going in, our principals had no authority over staff, no authority over money, and no authority over curriculum, but they were held accountable for how their schools performed. Now, you don't even need to go to college to know that that's a non-starter. And so we had to change it. We had to change the job of being a principal. And in order to do that, we had to go to the union. We had to go to the union to say we have to have the opportunity for our principals to hire their staff. And of course, they initially said no. But John Stanford's charisma permeated the city, and ultimately the union figured out that if John Stanford goes to the public and says the union is preventing me from improving your schools, that the public would have voted for John. They knew it, and they didn't want to take that risk. And so they acquiesced and allowed us to change the union contract so principals could hire staff without regard to seniority. We're the first urban district in the country to achieve that goal. And it's still, now, it's partially in place now, but most of it's not there. But anyhow, so this changed everything. And then we decided we had to give the principals authority over budgets. And so when we got on the school board, the money flowed to schools based on the adults in the building. One teacher, or 25 kids, one teacher. 500 kids, a vice principal. That's the way schools were funded. Principals had virtually no discretionary money whatsoever, had no budget authority. And so we changed it. And we put in what might be called a voucher, only we called it a weighted student formula. It's a weighted voucher. And the voucher didn't go to the parents, it went to the school. And the way it worked was we put a value on each child, and we recognized that certain children cost more to educate than other children. So for example, if your child and my child was a 1, that was a $6,000 child to the school. If your child English was a second language to your child might have been a 1.5. That's a $9,000 child for that school. If your child was a second language learner and had a dyslexia or some other malady of some sort, then she might be a 2, which means that's a $12,000 child. And then we put in choice. So parents could pick any school they wanted to in the system. And we modified that a little bit too because we found out you couldn't transport kids all over the place. So we created two high schools, 2 middle schools, and 4 elementary schools for every parent to choose from with transportation. But they could go to any school they wanted to if they could get their child there. So the net effect was shown one night at a PTA meeting. I was at an elementary school at a PTA meeting, and there were 4 middle schools at that meeting touting their wares to the parents of 5th grade students in that elementary school. 2 of these middle schools were magnet schools, 2 were regular middle schools. And they were talking about their curriculum, their academic performance, their athletics, their music, their art, whatever it was that they felt they were good at. That's what they were touting to these parents, trying to recruit them to come to their school. And I thought, this is the way it's supposed to work. It was wonderful. So that's what we did. And Seattle became a district on the move. We were starting to get national attention. We were written up as a district that was transforming itself. And academic achievement started to go up. Dropouts started to go down. Suspensions were going down. And in fact, enrollment went up for the first time in 25 years. People actually started moving back into the city of Seattle for the public schools. Amazing. So if I were giving this speech to you in 2001, I would be touting how it's possible to be inside a system and transform an urban system, because we did it, and it was exciting. But I hadn't been off the board more than 5 years, and I'm not saying it's because I left, but I and virtually all of my colleagues left about at the same time. By 2006, Seattle Public Schools had gone through 2 superintendents, had a financial crisis, had a dysfunctional school board, and virtually everything we had put in place had been terminated, reversed, or so much modified that it was no longer relevant. It's as if we had never been there. It's as if I had wasted 8 years. Now, that's disturbing enough. But what's really disturbing is that happens everywhere. You cannot find an urban system in America with an elected school board that is achieving multi-year programs of school improvement. They just don't exist. Now, you can see some with appointed school boards that are doing something, but I'll talk about them in a few minutes. So the net effect is that I have been proven wrong on both of my assumptions. Getting inside the system is not going to allow you to change in anything that's going to be sustainable. And obviously, the urban district is not the entity of change. But it's a rude awakening. But the reason I wrote this book is because of what I've learned since I got off the school board, not what I learned on the school board. And what I've learned since is that the entity of change is the state. It's not the school, it's not the district, and it's not the federal government. It's the state. And the reason it's the state is because the state controls both the people and the money that flows into our public school system. And as you well know, if you control money and people, then you control. And the control of our public education system rests in the state. And so if we want to fix our schools, we must first address the state. So let's talk about that. What do we need to do with the state? Well, before I get into that, let me just give you a brief history and status report on our present education system. Our present education system was established in the late 1800s. A guy named Horace Mann is considered the father of our public schools. Horace Mann was the Secretary of Education for the state of Massachusetts, and he was appointed, I think, in 1887. And Horace Mann, I don't know whether the governor of Massachusetts or Horace did this on his own, but the essence was there was a feeling they needed to educate the children of Massachusetts in order for them to be prepared for the Industrial Revolution that was going to sweep the country. And of course, the Industrial Revolution was already well underway in Europe. And so Horace Mann went to Europe, and he went to England, France, and Germany. And those days, Germany was called Prussia. And when he got to Prussia, he found what he was looking for. King Frederick had established a tax-supported public school system, the notion being to train the children of Prussia to be prepared to work in the factories and also to teach them obedience and control so they would be subservient subjects to the king. That was his goal. Now, Horace Mann thought, this looks pretty good to me, and he brought the model home. And he installed the Prussian education system in the state of Massachusetts. And by 1904, every state in that was then in the Union had established the identical system. And to this day, we have that system for our schools. And in that system, you'd had one teacher in about an 800 square foot classroom with about 25 kids. They would go to school a fixed number of hours per day, a fixed number of days per year. They would have specific subjects in reading, writing, and math. And they would get an effective education that would prepare them for the factory world. That's what we're doing. And it's been that way for 110 years. And so what we have today is a situation where the United States did just fine until about the 1950s. That kind of a school system was adequate because in those days we were a manufacturing economy and an agrarian economy. And the children were educated well enough to perform very well in that kind of an economy. But by the late 50s and early 60s, our economy started to change, and we have moved from being an agricultural and manufacturing economy to a technological and service economy. We have moved from being a domestic economy to being a global economy. And as a society, we have moved from being predominantly a white society to being a predominantly minority society. And all the while, our schools have operated pretty much as they always have. One person once said to me, if Rip Van Winkle had gone to sleep on January 1, 1900, and reawakened on January 1, 2000, the only thing in our society that would look familiar would be the school. And if there's any institution in our society that ought to keep up with the times, in fact, ought to anticipate the times, it's our schools. Today, we are number 20 of developed nations in high school graduation rates. We are number 24 of developed nations in college graduation rates. And we are number 27 of developed nations in the graduation of engineers and scientists. Now, I make that latter point because engineers and scientists are the lifeblood of any economy. They're the people who design and build the very things that you and I enjoy as a daily life. This year, our country will turn out about 60,000 engineers. This year, China will turn out 600,000 engineers. If we were doing as well as China, we would be turning out 180 to 200,000 engineers a year. What's even worse is that more than half of the students who become engineers in our country are foreign students. More than half of those who enter a college to study math and science are foreign students. Now, one of the reasons our children don't know math and science or are not interested in math and science, you've all heard the need for us to increase the number of STEM graduates, science, technology, engineering, and math. Our country's falling way behind in that. Well, the problem is that we don't have, the problem is that we don't have enough people going into science, but the source of that problem is we do not have enough teachers who know how to teach it. 69%, 69% of the middle school teachers teaching our children in grades 5 through 8, 69% who teach math have neither a degree nor a certificate in math. 93%, almost all, 93% of the teachers who teach the physical sciences to our middle school children, grades 5 through 8, have neither a degree nor a certificate in the physical sciences. Now, all of you know that your life was transformed by a teacher who was passionate about some kind of a subject, and they were able to instill that passion in you, and it transformed your life. But you cannot instill a passion for a subject if you yourself don't have it. And children at middle school are where they're at the age where they start to take an interest in certain kinds of things about life. And our middle school teachers are not prepared to create the STEM graduates that we desperately need as a society. And it won't change until we change that situation. The United States has the highest incarceration rate of any developed nation. Russia is number 2. Interestingly enough, the nations that have the best test scores on the international exams have the lowest incarceration rates. Surprise, surprise. And economically, it's a disaster. Walmart has 6,000 suppliers for their stores. 5,000 of those suppliers are headquartered in China. The United States has $18 trillion in debt, as you well know. More than half of that debt is owned by the Chinese. Now, you don't need to be a genius to know that we have a big problem on our hands. And the source of that problem is our failure to educate our children to a level that they need to live in this new society. And if we really want to bring our economy back, the fastest and frankly the only way to do it is to effectively educate our children. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to talk to you about teaching, leadership, and governance. All of the data that you can read about education tells you that the most important ingredient in the education of a child is the quality of the teacher in the classroom. Next only to the quality of the home or the parent, the teacher is the most important ingredient. And data shows you that if you take a high-performing teacher and put her in a class with a low-performing class, they become a high-performing class. Conversely, if you take a high-performing class and give them a low-performing teacher, they become a low-performing class. Now, this is not brain surgery, it's just common sense. So if we want to increase the academic achievement of our children, the fastest way to do it is increase the competency of our teaching force. So the question is, well, why haven't we done that? It's pretty simple. Well, the reason we haven't done it is because of the system that we have in place set up to train teachers. Now, back in the 20s, a thing called certification laws were passed, and these were passed throughout the country. Every state has them. And certification laws were designed to make sure that we had high-quality teachers in every classroom. And certification laws basically said we are going to certify people to be teachers. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to set up education schools and university campuses, and they will train our future teachers, and those teachers will come in and teach our children. And it made all kinds of sense. But then they said, only certified teachers will be allowed to teach our children. Now, that also seemed to make sense, but what has happened in the intervening years is that very provision has created a monopoly over the source of human capital that's allowed to go into our education system. Public education is the only institution in our society that requires the teachers to be certified. But the people in this room are obviously qualified to teach in any private school. Many of you could teach in a community college. Some of you probably could teach in a university, but you cannot teach in our public schools. The conductor of the Washington Symphony would not be allowed to teach music in the public schools. Bill Gates wouldn't be allowed to teach math or technology in the public schools. Some of our very best and brightest people are kept out of our schools because of these certification laws. And what's even worse, because of the monopolistic program, their progress that has occurred as a result of these laws, we now have 1,400 education schools in the United States. 1,400. Virginia next door has 50. Pennsylvania has over 90. The spectrum of quality between the best and the worst is substantial. Today, teaching is the easiest profession in our society to enter. The only requirements is that you have a high school graduation degree, a diploma, and you have money for tuition. That's it. No other qualifications. And if you have those two things, you can get into an education school, I guarantee it. And if you get in, you will graduate. And if you graduate, the odds are you'll get hired, and if you get hired in 2 years, you have tenured, and there we are. That's what happened. And so what we have is quality by accident, not by design. Now what we really ought to do is do what Finland did. You may have read about Finland. Finland closed all of their education schools except for 8, about 25 years ago. And they made those 8 schools so difficult to get in that they're harder to get into now, or as hard to get into as medical schools. Only 1 in 10 students get in. And even if you graduate from a Finnish education school, you're not yet qualified to teach. You have to pass an oral examination that proves your competency to teach, your knowledge competency, and your moral character. I love that last one. And guess what? Today, Finland has the highest performing students in the world. We need to create education schools, if we need them at all. But if they're going to be education schools, they have to be profoundly good at their task. If you're the dean of an education school, you have to be able to look me right in the eye and say, if you come to my school, I will make you a better teacher than you would be otherwise. And if you can't do that, I don't need to go. Today in education school, we teach our students how to teach content, as opposed to taking content-competent people and teaching them how to teach. We have it backwards. Education schools, and not education schools, but certification laws are the single biggest detriment to fixing our schools in our society today. And they're a state issue. Now, if you fix teaching and you don't fix leadership, it won't work. No outstanding teacher is going to work for an incompetent principal. And believe me, we have plenty of those. And interestingly enough, certification laws get in the way again. Because to become a principal, you must first have been a teacher for 2 to 3 years, and then you must go back to an education school to get a 1-year certificate in a principalship. That's it. Now, the qualifications to get into a principalship are just as easy as the qualifications to get into teaching. The only requirement is that you have 2 to 3 years of teaching experience and that you have enough money for tuition. As a consequence, some of our very worst teachers are the very first to apply to become principals. If you can't make it in the classroom, go into administration. It's easy. And as a consequence, we get leadership by accident, not by design. Well, we can't afford that. The power of a profoundly competent principal in a school is just enormous. You walk into any high-performing school, I guarantee you there's a high-performing principal. One begets the other. But you can't get one without the other. So the fastest way to improve our schools is to improve our leadership, and we must get rid of certification laws for that as well. Our principals need to be instructed by profoundly competent people on how to lead an organization, how to evaluate performance, how to teach competency, knowing really what good teaching looks like so they can help teachers perform better. We need the best and brightest of our leaders to go into public education, and we can't get there from here because of certification laws. And if that wasn't bad enough, it continues on at the superintendent level. In 45 of the 50 states, to become a superintendent, you have to be certified. The only place to get certified is an education school. And so you have to go back to an education school. And again, the only requirement is that you have been a principal and that you have money for tuition. Interestingly enough, when I was doing my little traveling around the countryside, I asked people, where's the best superintendent training program in the United States? And everybody said Harvard. And there's a gentleman up there that was running that program. And I called him. And I said, I'd like to come up and see you. And he said, fine, come up and see me. So I flew up to Boston, walked into his office, and after a few pleasantries, he said, what would you like to talk about? And I said, well, doctor, I'm thinking about applying to your program to become a superintendent. And he started to laugh. And I said, what's so funny about that? And he said, well, you're not qualified. I said, oh, really? No, you're not qualified. You have to have been a principal before you can become a superintendent. Oh, I said. And then he said, beside, even if you were qualified, you couldn't get in. I said, really? Why is that? He said, because we have a 3-year waiting list. And I said, really? How many students a year do you take? 9. 9? I said. You're the finest superintendent program in the United States. There's 18,000 school districts in the United States, and you take 9? We got a long haul ahead of us. And then I asked him, well, what would I learn if I came to this program? He wasn't very happy about that question, but I asked him. And he started pontificating about pedagogy and curriculum and this kind of stuff. And I said, well, how about capital expenditures? How about building bonds and levies? How about finance? How about union negotiations? No, we don't do that. I said, how about technology? Well, we have a computer on the 4th floor available to all students. It blew my mind. That was 1993. That program's still going, and I don't know whether they take now 12, but they don't have a big program. We need unbelievable leaders. One of the issues that we were allowed to do is Washington State is one of only 5 states that does not require the superintendent to be certified. And it was that loophole that allowed us to hire John Stanford. And John Stanford was the finest superintendent Seattle has ever seen before or since. And he once told me he had never been in a high school classroom since he graduated, and he most certainly had never taken a class in an education school. But he was a leader. He was a change agent. He was profoundly competent at what he wanted to do. So, my friends, if we fix leadership and we fix teaching, but we don't fix governance, it won't work. You heard me talk about it. You can't find a district in this country that's taken quality to scale. And the reason for that is the governance model. Now, what has happened over the years is that we've made running for public office so unattractive that really high-quality people choose not to do it. Oftentimes, regardless of the position, we're often choosing between bad and worse in the elected officials. And this is particularly true in school board. School board is probably the least attractive elected office out there, particularly in urban systems. And as a consequence, what I've noticed in Seattle is the type of people who run for public office for the school board are one of 3 types of people. They're single-issue fanatics, they're social activists, or they're union sympathizers. Now, there's nothing wrong with these types of people, but they're not the people you want running your schools. But that's what we have. In fact, today in Seattle, we have a very dysfunctional school board, and we have just hired our 5th superintendent in 8 years. The average lifespan of an urban superintendent in the United States is 3.1 years. What happens as a new school board gets elected, they have a different agenda, and that agenda includes a new leader. And I have to say to you that even if Seattle today had an absolutely profoundly competent school board, they would be hard-pressed to find a profoundly competent new superintendent. What happens in the superintendent arena is a revolving door of mediocrity. You get fired from one district, and you get hired by another one. That's the way it works. And so again, the governance model is broken. So what do we do about that? Well, I only have 2 ideas. One is to go to appointed school boards. That appears to be better. New York, Washington, Cleveland, Boston, Chicago, they've done that. And they've been able to put several years together of school improvement. But now you're seeing it right here in Washington, D.C. and in New York. We've got a new mayor and a new superintendent, and they're unraveling everything. So even there, it doesn't work unless you have changed state law so that you can get the other things working. The other option, if you don't go to appointed school boards, is get rid of them entirely. If you have a truly outstanding superintendent like John Stanford, he probably didn't need a board. He could have reported directly to the mayor, been part of the mayor's cabinet, just like the fire chief and the police chief. And then you might say, well, what if you have a lousy mayor? Well, if you have a lousy mayor, you're likely to get a lousy superintendent and a lousy school board. But today you can get a lousy superintendent and a lousy school board with a quality mayor. So most mayors know that schools are the most important single institution in any city, and they're unlikely, even an incompetent mayor is unlikely to appoint incompetent people to run the schools. So my friends, we have a problem on our hands. America's public school system is obsolete, and it has become increasingly obsolete as the years have progressed. If we want to seriously fix them, it's like a failing business. You know, in a failing business, the last thing, the first thing you would not do in a failing business is pour more money into it. The first thing you would do in a failing business is change management. And you might not only just change the CEO, you might get the entire top management changed. And then you'd let them come up with a new game plan. And then and only then would you consider putting in more money. We have been doing the reverse. For the last 40 years, every reform movement that you've seen in our public education has been designed to tweak or modify or slightly change the existing system. And almost invariably, they cost more money. Today, we spend 3 times as much per child as we did 40 years ago in inflation-adjusted dollars. 3 times more money. We now have twice as many adults in the education system as we did in 1970 on a per-student basis. Twice as many adults. Adult employment has grown 4 times faster than enrollment over the last 40 years. America's public schools is the largest government employment plan that we have. Now, we have to fix it. And fixing it is not going to be easy. This is a $600 billion enterprise with 6 million employees that is the most unified, unionized entity in our society. So it's going to take a remarkable governor and a remarkable legislature to take this on, because you're going to be taking on the bureaucracy, you're going to be taking on the unions, and you're going to be taking on universities, because education schools have become cash cows to universities. That's why there's so many of them. They're a high-profit entity on any campus. But that's the changes I believe we must make, and we must make those 3 changes. One without the other doesn't work. You have to make all 3, and if you make all 3, we can begin the process of changing our school system. But to try to change our school system without these 3 things, in my mind, is a waste of time, and it will not work. So, if you want to know more about what I think about schools, you have to read the book. But I think we have to start there. And my own belief is that if we as a society want to fix, we want to fix our economy, we want to fix our medical care, we want to fix our tax plan, if we want to fix our debt, if we want to fix our incarceration issues, our juvenile justice system, I don't care what it is that ails our society today, the fastest way to fix it is to educate our children. And the only way to do that is to create a public education system that gives them the education they both need and deserve. So the time has come for us to insist that every child has the opportunity for a quality education in every school. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions? I don't know if we have any questions or not. But yes, sir.
Canadian Media, what has been your experience with Common Core?
Well, Common Core, as many of you may know, is a new set of standards. Well, it's a new set of curriculum followed by some examinations against that standard curriculum. And it deals with language arts, writing, and math. So it's got those 3 components to it. Common Core, well, let me back up. We need standards. I don't think there's any question. You have to know whether you've achieved whatever it is you're trying to do. So you have to have some standard. Whether the Common Core is the right standard or not is hard to say. There are a lot of people that say these are terrific standards, and there's a standard for every grade in those 2 subjects. And then there's an examination. But where the pushback has occurred is that the Secretary of Education has decided that the Common Core is necessary for certain federal funding. And that has all of a sudden made it a national curriculum. And there's been enormous pushback, and rightfully so. The federal government has no business deciding what the curriculum should be in our schools. In my mind, that's the pushback. And whether they're good or bad is not nearly as important as who's pushing them. And if you have a chance to look at the, you know, I have to be honest, I haven't read every curriculum for every grade and every examination, so I'm not sitting here or standing here saying I'm an expert in Common Core. The one thing I do know is our schools will have to have standards, and they may or may not be the Common Core. Yes, ma'am.
You're familiar with the Khan Academy and the...
Yes.
I would like to know how that could be integrated into, along with the changes
Yes.
you're...
Very good question. She was talking about the Khan Academy and how it might change public education. There's a chapter in my book on technology. Technology is a game changer, no question about it. And technology is the issue that allows us to individualize education like never before. I call it the best invention since the one-room schoolhouse, because it will individualize. It can individualize education. And going back to the Common Core question, if we use technology properly, it's possible to monitor the progress of any child in any subject for any length of period of time and know whether or not they've learned. And so you don't need an end of test exam, because you will know going in they've learned it, because they can't move forward until they have. And so the Khan Academy is an online set of courses prepared by Saul Khan that now has 5 million people around the world taking various courses, science, mathematics, English. He's done a marvelous job. There's a course called Coursera from Stanford that's doing much the same thing with college-level courses. Technology is going to change the game plan. But you need to have teachers who understand technology and understand how to use it and teach it. Now, interestingly enough, you know, we teach Algebra 2 to all of our students, but we don't teach technology and how to use it. Now, I have to tell you, our children are going to spend a lot more time dealing with technology than they will Algebra 2. Not that they don't need to know Algebra 2, but we haven't changed our graduation rates in 110 years. The world has changed. But technology is a big deal. Big deal. Yes, sir.
Sorry if this may duplicate something that was briefly said. I'm curious about incentive. The teachers that I most responded to were
Right.
clearly interested in teaching.
Right.
But it also became a necessity for them to think about going in administration because they needed greater pay. They needed the
Exactly.
benefits. But then it led to, as you're saying, the problem of tenure, or once they're there, they never move along. So how can we get an incentive into the system that just doesn't seem to be quite there?
A very good question. The question is about compensation of teachers. Again, in the book, I talk about this. There's a state teacher salary schedule in every state. And that salary schedule is based on number of years teaching and academic credentials achieved. It has nothing to do with whether you're a good teacher or not. So in our teaching system, we have some profoundly terrible teachers who make the most money and some profoundly wonderful teachers who don't. That makes no sense. And incidentally, in the teaching profession, it's the only profession in our society where promotion is done by self-selection. Because if you're a teacher, you can decide unilaterally to become a principal, and you will. We need to change that too. But as far as compensation goes, I've studied compensation a lot. And a beginning teacher in most places is going to make between $40,000 and $45,000 a year, starting. The average teacher in Seattle makes $70,000 a year. The average teacher in New York makes $79,000 a year. Now that doesn't sound that bad for a bachelor's level degree, but in addition to the $70,000, they have a benefit package that's worth somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000. So now they're up to about $85,000. But that's not the issue. A teacher is paid for 1,320 hours of work. Doesn't matter how long they work. They are paid for 1,320 hours. That's the normal union contract term. Now, if you were paid, well, let me use the Seattle example. The average teacher in Seattle at $70,000 a year on 1,320 hours, I think, if I remember right, is $57 and some odd cents per hour. The average worker, all of you, will work 2,080 hours in a year. If we multiplied $57 an hour times 2,080, the average teacher in Seattle would be making $111,000 a year, plus a benefit package no private sector employer could justify. Okay? So, in my mind, teachers are not underpaid, they're underemployed. It's not a compensation problem at all. It's an employment issue. And how do you address that? Well, think about it. Certain children are less prepared for school than others, but we treat them all the same. Every child, even a child that's 2 years behind at kindergarten, will only go to kindergarten 180 days a year, like the kid who's already 2 years ahead. This makes no sense. So we need to extend the school day and the school year for those children who are behind. Well, this offers us an opportunity to change the compensation system for teachers. We can hire teachers for a 9-month contract, a 10-month contract, an 11-month contract. As a teacher, you decide which one you want. As an employer, I'll decide which one you get. Okay? But the 11-month contract teacher is going to make $111,000 a year. And we'll have school open longer for children to learn so they can get up to standard and stay as close to their age group as possible. But it's not a compensation problem. Now, having said all of that, we also need a career ladder for teachers. So you can start as a beginning teacher, maybe a senior teacher, maybe master teacher, maybe principal teacher. I don't know what the night terms are. You should probably have 4 levels of promotion within the teaching profession so that a truly outstanding teacher can stay in the profession and make good money. That's not allowed today either, but it should be. So those are my 2 solutions to the compensation issue. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. The union. Well, I have a chapter on unions. Well, unions are the single biggest constraint to fixing our schools out there. No question about it. One time I had lunch with the president of the Washington Education Association, and I asked her, I said, what's the mission of the union? And she looked at me kind of strange, and she said, well, the education of children, of course. And I looked at her and I said, no, that's not your mission. And we debated that question for an hour and a half. And by the end of the hour and a half, she agreed that the mission of the union was to maximize teacher employment, to secure teacher employment, maximize teacher compensation, to secure teacher employment, and to improve teacher working conditions. That's their job. That's their mission. And quite frankly, they are superb at accomplishing their mission. But none of those things have anything to do with the education of children. So it's the wrong mission. But they do it, and they do it well. But once you understand what they're in business for, then you can deal with it. And in my book, what I suggest is that we not worry about unions until we fix management. Because if you watch the private sector union membership is going this way. Public sector union membership is going this way. And what has happened in the private sector is that CEOs and management teams have understood that their major asset goes home at night. And they better take care of them. And when you take care of them, you don't need a union. And I saw what leadership does in Seattle. We were able to change a union contract. Seattle, the state of Washington is one of the most unionized states in the country. And we were able to change one of the most prized provisions of their union contract. We were able to change it within 18 months of his arrival. It shows you the power of leadership. So before we take on unions, let's fix management. So I think we have that problem first. And I would argue that unions are not the problem today. Management is the problem. Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
We do have copies of every school if you would like to purchase one while you're here, and I'm sure Don would be glad to talk further. I'm still trying to find out how my grandfather only went through the 3rd grade and still knew more than most people do today with their college education. At least he can write and read cursive and a few other things. But do thank you for your attendance.